Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. And this week, we're going to talk about circumstantial evidence. It turns out that in the Gemara on Sanhedrin daf lamed zayin amud bet, the issue of circumstantial evidence comes up. And it's, first of all, interesting to see what counts as circumstantial evidence, right? Circumstantial evidence comes up because it's been told, certainly in the Mishnah that the Gemara is responding to, that the Eidim are warned in a dinei nefashot case, in a capital case, that they should not be giving edut me omed, aleph, vav, mem, daled. They should not be giving testimony based on circumstantial evidence. And the Gemara on lamed zayin amud bet talks about what might be a case of circumstantial evidence. And the example that is brought is, let me just share my screen. Here's an example of what it might be. Shema kach re'item. Maybe you saw this. We say to the Eidim. Sheratz achar chaviro lechurba. Somebody was running after someone else into a ruin. Veratztem acharav, and you ran after. Umitzatem sayef biado v'damo v'taftef v'harug mifarper. And the scene that you found is the person who you think is the murderer is holding a sword that's dripping with blood, and the person who's dead is actually on the floor, fluttering, trembling, with kind of death tremors. If you saw this, you saw nothing, right? So this is really interesting because the thing that's circumstantial about this is you didn't actually witness the murder. You witnessed all of the context created for the murder, and you witnessed the aftermath of the murder, but you didn't witness the murder itself. And then it brings a similar story with Shimon ben Shetach, who essentially says, oh gosh, I know that you're the murderer, but there's nothing I can do because it has to be al pi shnayim edim, and I don't have it. And then miraculously, a snake comes and kills the murderer, right? So basically saying we can't get justice in court. Divine justice is going to have to be meted out some other way. And Shimon ben Shetach actually calls for divine justice and says, God, who's Yodea Machshavot, will take care of you, right? So this circumstantial evidence, I just want to say, is very, it's a very high bar not to use circumstantial evidence of this caliber. And what I want to think about with you is, why would you or wouldn't you use circumstantial evidence? And the reason why I even think there are places where you would is simply because the Gemara itself then says, while in dinei nefashot we don't use circumstantial evidence, in dinei mamonot we can, right? As you see below, b'dinei nefashot hudelo amdinan, ha b'dinei mamonot amdinan. In a case of capital punishment, we don't use omed, we don't use circumstantial evidence or presumptive evidence, but in dinei mamonot, in financial cases, we do. Kiman, who is this following? Ki Rabbi Acha. Like Rabbi Acha, Detanya, we have in a Braita, Rabbi Acha Omer, Gamal ha'ocher ben ha'gamalim. If there is a camel that is essentially, I don't know if this is the right word, but it's in heat, like the camel is actually engaging in a sexual relationship with another camel, and it probably kicks while it's doing that, right? So if v'nimtza gamal harug b'tzido, if another camel is found dead next to it, biyadua shezeh harago, right? We know that this camel that was in heat is the one that did it, right? And that's a financial issue because the owner of the camel is going to have to pay. So here we have, the Gemara establishes for us that in dinei nefashot, we don't use omed, the circumstantial evidence, but in dinei mamonot, we do. So the first thing I want to do is try to understand that. And I think it's interesting to consider that there may be other ways that the idea of omed fits into dinei mamonot more than it fits into dinei nefashot in general. So first thing I included on your sources, the Tosefta passages, where both the Shimon ben Shetach story come from, and this issue about the Gamal, where Rav Acha is first quoted, or Rabbi Acha, I should say, is first quoted, just so that you have it. You see that it comes from an earlier source. It comes from the Tosefta. But now I want to look at some of the logic behind using Omed, using circumstantial evidence in Dinei Mamonot. So one perspective is expressed in the Gemara in Baba Batra, Daf Tzadik Gimel Amud Aleph. And in that Gemara, what happens is there's a machloket about whether rove, whether majority, is something that is machria, right? Whether rove, majority, determines our understanding of something that has happened. And the Gemara compares the issue of rove to the issue of omed, our situation. It says, Lema Kitanai, maybe a dispute between Rav and Shmuel as to whether to apply rove as something that impacts the case is like the machloket Tanaim about omed, which comes from the Tosafta. Shor shahaya ro'ev v'nimtza shor harug b'tzido, an ox that was grazing and another ox is found dead next to it, even though the dead animal has been gored. And this shore is even a shore muad. It's been established that this is a gorer ox. Or this animal that's dead has been bitten, and this ox has already been established to be a biter. Nonetheless, we cannot say we know that the first ox gored or bit the second ox. In other words, we're not going to use omed, right? We're not going to use circumstantial evidence. We didn't see the actual murder. Rabbi Acha Omer, and Rabbi Acha, who of course we saw quoted in our Gemara, Gamal ha'ocher ben ha'gamalim, if there is a gamal having sex among the other camels, v'nimtza gamal harug b'tzido, and there's another camel that's dead next to it, biyadua shezeh hareka. We know that this camel killed the other camel, and therefore the owner of the killer camel is going to have to pay. So you see, we want to suggest that the machloket about rove is similar to the machloket about omed. Savruha, what they suggest is deruba v'chazaka ki hadadi ninhu. Rove and chazaka are similar to each other, right? In the case of the animals, we see that there is a chazaka that an animal, while it's in heat, is going to kick other animals, or this animal is already muad to be a nagchan, to be a gorer. So there you have a chazaka, and that chazaka is what establishes what's going on. Similarly, if you have rove, we might allow the rove to determine what's going on. The comparison between these two things, I think, is very instructive. First of all, the use of the concept of chazaka is essentially saying that sometimes our omed, circumstantial evidence, is based on the idea of chazaka. Like, if this situation happens, then likely X will happen. Or maybe it's similar to rove. Most times that such and such would happen, this would occur, right? So there is a world within Dinei Mamonot in which the idea of circumstantial evidence really fits, right? So maybe that's why, of course, we wouldn't use it in Dinei Nefashot, because that whole issue is not involved there. But in Dinei Mamonot, we use rove, we use chazaka, so let's use umdina. Why not? Another explanation for those who remember the shiur, or if you don't remember the shiur, I definitely invite you to go back to it, that we gave on umdina a few, months ago, maybe. The issue of umdina was not an issue like we're saying here, circumstantial evidence based on which people conclude what happened in the facts of the case, but it was actually umdina about the da'at of a person who's selling or giving a gift, right? Remember, we had the case where someone wrote off all of their possessions to another person and only later found out that they actually had a son who could inherit them. So we say, ooh, umdana, that this person only wrote off all their other possessions to another person because they thought they didn't have a son to inherit them, right? So we can't say that it applies, right? So we have actually in Dine Mamonot already a different kind of umdana specific. You don't have to go to chazaka, you don't have to go to rove comparisons. We already have a different kind of umdana that exists there. And so when the Rush talks about umdana, he talks comfortably about a type of umdana that's trying to establish the da'at of someone who did something, gave a gift, sold something, sold all their possessions, alongside the type of umdana that is circumstantial evidence in trying to figure out what happened. And here's where he says it in a tshuva. And in lots of places, the sages of the Talmud followed a presumption that is so evident, right? Remember, this is what we talked about in that shir, the difference between just an umdana and an umdana demuchach, right? One of the things we said about an umdana demuchach is it's clear as day that everybody would act in such a manner, right? It's not just some idiosyncratic element of this person's thinking. It's everybody in the world would do this. So, for example, gabe shtar mivrachat, if somebody writes a contract to alienate their assets, somebody who writes away all their possessions and only afterwards finds out they have a son, and the gift of somebody who's on their deathbed, and I'm assuming bikula means somebody who's giving away all of their stuff. Israel, the person, if you recall, the person who sold their stuff because they were moving to Israel, and in the end they didn't move. And then he says, Vigamal ha'ocher ben hagmalim. And likewise, a camel that's in heat among other camels, right? So one of these things is not like the other, right? Because the earlier examples that the Rush gives are umdana that's trying to establish the da'at of a person who did an action. Whereas gamal ha'ocher ben hagmalim, it's a presumption that we're making about what actually physically concretely took place. And the Maharik, by the way, 15th century France, totally disagrees with the Rush and says, no, you have to distinguish between these two umdanas, right? It says, Devadai de kol hecha masa mevuror etzel hadayanim. Ela sha'anu mesupakim ba'umdan dat hanotenu amocher o hamagarsha azlinan bata umdana. He says, look, you got to make a distinction. In a situation where we know the facts of the case and we're just trying to figure out what we think the da'at of the person who gave the gift or sold the item or divorced his wife, then we follow umdana, meaning umdana demuchach. Aval hecha delonit barer guf hamasa etzel hadayanim, where we haven't even established the facts of the case. The judges don't even know fully the facts of the case. Like the camel that we presume kicked and killed while it was copulating. We don't even know if it actually gored the imlav or not. Omed, except through circumstantial presumption. The rabbis never would agree with Rabbi Acha on this, that you should follow it. The Kaimalan Kavatayu, and we should be following them, right? So I like that the Maharik says, no. This is not just in the world of all umdana that we use in financial matters, right? So first of all, what we have is perhaps the reason why we're willing to use umdana in financial matters and not in dinin nefashot is because it already has a world in which it lives, right? It lives in the world of rove and chazaka, and maybe the umdana that we do on the dot of somebody who gives a gift or sells something, right? It kind of belongs to this world, okay? But we have a little bit of a monkey wrench. Here comes the monkey wrench, okay? The monkey wrench comes about because there's a Gemara in Shavuot that we also learned a while back that talks about, based on a Mishnah, that talks about the possibility of using circumstantial evidence to know that one person wounded another person, okay? Now already we're in interesting waters because I understand we're still talking about someone just owing money for wounding the person. But we've also moved to something that could perhaps be a similar situation. What if it was a mortal wound? Then we're in Dinei Nefashot territory, aren't we? So the Mishnah in Shavuot starts, Kol nishba'in shebat Torah nishba'in v'lo meshalmin. Anyone who's taking a biblical shvuah is taking it as a defendant, and it means they won't have to pay, right? We're talking about a financial case. Ve'elu nishba'in v'not lid. But here are rabbinic shvuot, where we let the plaintiff take a shvuah and collect money. Hasachir, someone who claims they haven't been paid. Hanigzal, someone who was robbed and is suing. V'hanechbal, someone who's wounded. V'shekenegdo chashud ala shvuah, or a case where really the defendant should be the one taking a shvuah, but can't because they have the legal status of being suspect that their shvuah will be a lie. So then their plaintiff gets to take a shvuah and collect the money. And v'chen vani al pinchaso, a storekeeper who's relying on the tabs that they're keeping, okay? But what's interesting for our purposes is the nechbal, someone who gets wounded. So tell me what happens here. We're saying that a person who got wounded takes a shvuah and collects their money, right? So the Gemara on Daf Mem Vav Amud Bet says, let's talk about this case. Nechbal Ketzad. How did this wounding situation exactly play out? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Lo shanu ela b'makom she'achol lechabel ba'atzma. The only time the plaintiff here who's wounded even needs to take a shvuah is if the wound is in a place where the plaintiff actually could have done it herself, right? I punch myself in the face, give myself a bruise, and then I say somebody else did it, right? But if it's in a place where I can't actually hurt myself, let's say the middle of my back, right? Notel shelo b'shvuah. I can get it without a shvuah. Sounds like circumstantial evidence to me. The Gemara says, V'neichush dilma b'kotel nidchakech. The Gemara says, what do you mean? Maybe I just bumped myself into a wall on purpose. Tani Rabbi Chia, so Rabbi Chia says, let me tell you the case. Shaltalo nishicha begabo uvein atzile yadav. I have a bite on my back. Couldn't have done that to myself, and I couldn't do that with a wall. Or I have a bite on my elbow. Can't do that either, right? So we say, okay, the dilma acher avidle. Maybe somebody else did this, right? Not the person who I'm trying to sue. Deleka acher. There's nobody else who was there. Now remember, this is a situation where, based on the Mishnah, you saw me and my defendant walk into a place together and I was fine. And then I walk out and I'm wounded. And basically the Gemara is saying here, if it's a wound that I could not have inflicted on myself, then based on what I would call circumstantial evidence, I'm allowed, even without a shvuah, to just get money from the defendant. So this just got interesting because this seems like circumstantial evidence being used in a case where it's not animal hurting animal, it's a human being hurting another human being. And what if I change this case a little bit to be, instead of, you bit me and I got hurt, what if it's a situation where you gave me a mortal wound? Would I say we can use that to give the death penalty? And suddenly we do have Omid in Edut for dinei nefashot? Or do we say, well, no, even if it's the exact same situation, you saw the people walking in, I was fine, then I'm dead on the floor with an injury I could not have inflicted on myself, would we still say, no, it's dinei nefashot, don't do it. Don't use that to give the death penalty? Is it just because we want to be maybe more careful in dinei nefashot? What exactly is going on here? Now, I will say there's another Gemara that's a little bit of a problem for us. The Gemara in Shavuot also, but Daf Lamed Daled, where the Gemara indicates that you could look at it for yourself, that Rabbi Acha thinks that not only does Omed work, circumstantial evidence work in financial situations, but it also works in dinei nefashot. But that you can look at on your own time. But suffice it to say, this situation of the nechbal, somebody who's been wounded, and the ability to rely on circumstantial evidence for that does open the door to a possibility of applying circumstantial evidence to a situation of a mortal wound. And that's exactly where the Balei HaTosfot go. The Balei HaTosfot in Shavuot say, Mishkachat la umdina bedinei nefashot l'kulei alma. There is actually a case of umdina that works in dinei nefashot, according to everybody. Kimosh al talo nishichal rosho v'nekav krum al shel moach. So, for example, let's say a person has a bite on their head, or they have a hole in the, I think we call it the meninges, that protects your brain. Dafilu rabbanan modu bahai umdana. Says even the rabbis would agree that that umdana is legitimate, right? As it's proven in what we just saw with the case of the nechbal. Like a person who gets a bite on their back or a bite on their elbows. Meaning, according to Balei HaTosfot, there is a case of circumstantial evidence that might be used in capital cases, that you could give capital punishment on the basis of it. So I want us to think back, because our original Gemara, Sanhedrin Lamed Zayin Amud Bet, gave us a case of Shimon ben Shetach where it seems like it was basically the same case. Somebody's running after somebody else. I walk in, I see someone dead on the floor. I see the other person holding a dripping knife. It's obvious who killed whom here. How is that any different from, I see two people walk into a building, one of them looks fine, and then I walk into the building and I see that the person has a mark on them that they couldn't have made themselves, and now they're dead, and there's only one other person there. Aren't those the same case? So Rav Kook says, nope, they're not the same case. Okay? He says, no. There's circumstantial evidence and there's circumstantial evidence. The same way when we talked about umdina, when we were trying to figure out the thought process of someone who gives a gift or sells something, etc., where sometimes we said, oh, that's umdina, and that's not strong enough. And other times we said, no, that's umdina, the muhach, that is very strong. Maybe the same thing here. Maybe there are stronger and less strong. So he says, "Va'adifa afilu mea umdina de Shimon ben Shetach." Rav Kook Senior says, this is even better, this nechbal situation. It's even stronger than the circumstantial evidence in the Shimon ben Shetach case. Why? The Sham, because in the Shimon ben Shetach case, af al pi she'inyan muchach tuva, right? Even though it's pretty clear what probably happened. Mikol makom, nonetheless, yesh makom lomar sheharug ibed et atzmo l'dat b'sayev zeh mitavdeh. You could theoretically argue that this person who's dead in the chorva grabbed the sword and killed themselves with it. And then and afterwards the pursuer picked it up. Now, of course, it would be so interesting, like people who do forensics and blood splatter and all these things, but that's for another time. The only problem with that argument, right, before forensics, I would say, the only problem with that argument is, come on, that's not the most likely scenario, right? Our umdina tells us the person holding the knife right now was the murderer. Aval, but in the case of the nechbal, which now we're saying, what if it was a mortal wound? Right? He's working off of Tosfot. If somebody has a bite on the inside of their brain, and the only people there are the murdered person and the other person, it's clear, b'torat yedi'a. It's clear that, like as though we know it, right? It's like a ironclad proof that this one killed the other. So Rav Kook is basically saying, look, it's not that we never follow umdina in cases of dinei nefashot. It's that if you have an umdina that is, it's not really just an umdina because it's impossible for anything else to have happened, then we'll even follow it in dinei nefashot, right? So then you might be saying, in general, for dinei nefashot, we need the highest version of evidence and proof, whereas for dinei mamonot, in general, less so. But even in dinei nefashot, we're not going to stand on ceremony to say because you didn't physically see it. If it's so clear as day, without a doubt that it happened, then, it's fine. We're going to use it to do dinei nefashot. I want to end with one last thing because it's fascinating to see where umdina is used. That's not about dinei mamonot, and it's not about dinei nefashot. There's a case from post-World War II where Rav Mordechai Yaakov Breish, the Av Beit Din in Zurich, was asked by a Beit Din in Yerushalayim about freeing a woman who had been an aguna, a woman from Zurich, who had become an aguna because her husband, during the Shoah, was taken with a group of men to a death camp. Nobody from that group returned, but she didn't have ironclad proof that he was dead. It was just very strong circumstantial evidence. And it's, a harrowing tshuva. And I just want to read a piece of it. Mikol Hanal, from everything mentioned, Chazinan, we see de umdina mevureret nikra begeder yedi'a below Re'iyah. He says, when we talk about umdina that's so clear, it's called being known without being seen, which, by the way, is based on one of those Gemaras in Shvuot, Yedi'a below Re'iyah, being known even without being seen. Dimahani le'inyan mamon, that works in financial matters. Ulashita Tosfot Hanal, and according to Tosfot, our Tosfot, af bedinei nefashot, it works in capital cases, and I'll put in parentheses, only because it's mivureret, because it's the clearest, right? It's parallel to what we talked about in terms of the dot of a mocher or a notain or a megarish. It was umdina demuchach, so this is umdina mivureret. It's so clear. Ulashita poskim hanal, and he says, according to the decisors who I quoted before, af le'inyan kiddushin ve'eshet ish, you can even use umdina in the case of betrothal and a married woman. He has a whole conversation before about why when a woman presents the get that she has, we can assume that it actually came from her ex-husband. But not for now, but he talks about umdina in that regard. So he says, in Cain, if that's the case, mikol shekain le'inyan edut isha, how much more so in a case here of aguna where we use edut isha, we use the testimony of a woman to establish that someone has died, that the husband has died. Delo by edut gemura, it doesn't have the same requirements as edut usually does. Demahani yedi'a below re'iyah. Certainly in this case, Yedi'a below Ra'iya, knowledge even without seeing. Very, very, very clear circumstantial evidence would be sufficient. So there's definitely high stakes to the question of whether you're going to use umdina and where you're going to use umdina. And I hope this gives us a sense of really an appreciation for a pursuit of justice and righteousness. That really this conversation about Omed, not applying it in Dinei Nefashot, is part of a pursuit of justice. Applying it when it's so clear in Dinei Nefashot is part of a pursuit of justice. Applying it in situations of mamonot, part of a pursuit of justice. Applying it in a case of aguna, part of a pursuit of justice. Thanks for learning with me, everybody.